You are looking at one of the most recognizable skylines on the planet. The glass towers of Lower Manhattan, Wall Street, the financial district, the absolute center of global capitalism. But here is a fact that almost nobody knows. Directly beneath your feet, under the asphalt, under the subway tunnels, under the foundations of the stock exchange itself, lies the ghost of a completely different city. A city with canals, a city with windmills, a city where traders haggled in 18 different languages before the United States ever existed. This was New Amsterdam. And it didn't just precede New York, it invented it. Let's go back. The year is 1626. The place is the southern tip of a long, forested island the Lenape people called Mannahatta, the island of many hills. A Dutch official named Peter Minuit has just completed one of the most consequential real estate transactions in human history. For 60 guilders worth of trade goods, tools, cloth, and metal objects, the Dutch West India Company formally claims the island. The Lenape likely understood it as a temporary use rights agreement, not a permanent sale of land as European legal tradition defined it. Two entirely different concepts of land ownership collided that day on the banks of the Hudson, and the consequences would echo for centuries. But the Dutch were not here for philosophy. They were here for beaver pelts. The global fur trade in the early 17th century was an economic engine of extraordinary power. European demand for felt hats made from beaver fur had driven the animal to near extinction across the continent. The Dutch West India Company, a ruthless and efficient commercial enterprise modeled on the already legendary Dutch East India Company, saw an opportunity and seized it. New Amsterdam was not founded as a dream or an ideal. It was founded as a counting house on the edge of the wilderness, designed to extract maximum profit from a resource-rich continent and ship it back to Amsterdam. The settlement itself in its earliest years was frankly miserable. The first colonists, a mix of Walloon refugees, Dutch traders, German laborers, and various contracted workers, lived in rough pit houses dug into the earth, covered with bark and thatch. There was no grand urban plan. There were no cobblestone streets. There was mud. There were rats. There was the constant danger of conflict with local Lenape bands. The mortality rate was high. Morale was frequently catastrophic. But something extraordinary happened. The company, desperate to make the settlement viable, made a decision that would define the character of New York for the next 4 centuries. They opened the doors. Deliberately and strategically, New Amsterdam became one of the most diverse and tolerant settlements in the entire Atlantic world. By the 1640s, a French Jesuit missionary visiting the tiny colony of barely 500 people reported hearing 18 distinct languages spoken in the streets. Dutch, English, French, Portuguese, German, Swedish, Finnish, and multiple West African languages filled the air of this small trading post at the edge of the known world. Now stop and picture the physical city. By the 1650s, New Amsterdam had taken on a recognizable Dutch urban character. The streets at the southern tip of Manhattan were narrow and irregular, following the logic of trade and cattle paths rather than any formal grid. The houses were Dutch in style, stepped gable facades of yellow and red brick, imported as ballast on ships from Holland, with wooden shutters painted in dark greens and reds. The rooflines were distinctive, the iconic Dutch crow step gable, tiered like a staircase against the sky. Gardens ran behind the houses. Orchards extended north toward the wild interior of the island. The city had a canal. This is the fact that stops most people cold. Running directly along what is now Broad Street in Lower Manhattan was a genuine Dutch-style canal called the Heere Gracht, the High Canal, dug by enslaved African laborers in the 1650s. Boats moved through it. Merchants unloaded goods along its banks. It smelled, as all 17th century urban canals smelled, of fish, refuse, and saltwater. It was the commercial artery of the town. Today, Broad Street is one of the widest streets in Lower Manhattan. The reason it is so unusually wide is that it was built directly on top of the filled-in canal. And then there is the wall. In 1653, Director General Peter Stuyvesant, fearing a British military assault from the north, ordered the construction of a defensive wooden palisade wall across the full width of Manhattan Island, from the Hudson River to the East River. Enslaved Africans and Dutch colonists built it together. It was 12 feet tall, reinforced with earth, and punctuated with cannon placements. The wall was never actually tested in battle, but the road that ran along its southern base became the most important financial street in the history of the modern world. Wall Street takes its name directly from that Dutch defensive barrier. Speaking of Peter Stuyvesant, here is a man who deserves his own documentary. He arrived in New Amsterdam in 1647 with a silver-tipped wooden prosthetic leg, having lost his right leg to a cannonball during a military campaign in the Caribbean. He was authoritarian, deeply religious, quick to fury, and genuinely brilliant as an urban administrator. He paved streets, established the first municipal fire watch, created the city's first hospital, organized the first postal system in North America, and attempted to regulate the rampant sale of alcohol in a city that had, by some counts, one tavern for every 4 or 5 households. He also tried vigorously to expel the city's Jewish community, Sephardic Jews who had fled the Portuguese conquest of Dutch Brazil in 1654, and was overruled directly by the directors in Amsterdam, who reminded him that the company had Jewish shareholders. The Jews stayed. New Amsterdam's tradition of pragmatic tolerance held, even when its governor fought against it. The city's relationship with slavery is a history that cannot and should not be minimized. The Dutch West India Company introduced enslaved Africans to New Amsterdam as early as the 1620s. By the mid-17th century, enslaved people made up a significant portion of the colony's labor force. They built the wall, they dug the canal, they constructed the fort. Some enslaved individuals under the company's ownership were granted a peculiar status called half-freedom. They could live and work independently, own land and legally marry, but their children remained enslaved, and they owed annual tribute payments to the company. The first free black community in Manhattan, centered around what is now the area of City Hall Park, was built on this precarious and unjust foundation. And then, on a September morning in 1664, everything ended. 4 English warships sailed into the harbor under the command of Colonel Richard Nichols. They carried a force that vastly outnumbered the colony's defenders. Peter Stuyvesant stamped his silver leg on the ramparts of Fort Amsterdam, cursed in Dutch, and prepared to fight. His own citizens refused. The merchants, the traders, the diverse community that had built this improbable city. They sent a petition, signed by Stuyvesant's own son, begging the Director General to surrender rather than see the town destroyed. Stuyvesant tore the letter to pieces. Then he read it, wept, and surrendered. Not a single shot was fired. New Amsterdam became New York in an afternoon. What the Dutch left behind was invisible and yet total. The grid of streets in Lower Manhattan still follows Dutch property lines. The tradition of religious and ethnic tolerance that made New York into the immigrant capital of the world was seeded in the company's pragmatic open-door policy. The most powerful city in the history of the modern world began as a muddy beaver pelt trading post, run by a company, built by the enslaved and populated by refugees who had nowhere else to go. That is not a diminishment. That is the most New York story ever told. If this kind of deep dive into lost cities and buried history is what you are here for, hit subscribe and stay with us. There is so much more still to uncover.